Hey, hey, Laura J here with
Hey,
Kenneth Scott with PanTerra Vita and GemStone University for our second interview this June 11th of 2025. How are you, Ken?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Excellent, thank you. And very
Good.
appreciative of the conversation we had privately before coming on as well, just to get on the same page and to recap where we left off in the last and where we've come to privately, and then where we really want to navigate these uncharted territories together in the course of this conversation, which it's
Sounds
really
good.
wonderful to be able to not spear fight, but to be able to.
You could say fence. We're not sparing.
Yes, I love that. Yes, absolutely. This is a fencing opportunity, and it's
Yeah,
an opportunity to get off the fence and not choose sides. The place that where I'd really love to start that was really helpful for me in our last conversation was around the debt system that we had talked about as the double entry booking trust,
hmm
that the heavenly realms of the private and the ecclesiastical realms of the public are concerned, and the debts and credits. And prior to when we came on live now, we were actually speaking to relational currency and how that fits into the debt system, and how the debts that we have in terms of the relationships we have with one another who are here, I feel is going to have a huge impact on the way that funds are distributed when people are able to actually gain access to the abundance and wealth of equity that we are the stakeholders in, given that we're the ones who can put our stakes in the ground to claim territory if we know how, which is part of what your status correction program is around. And something that I've been working towards myself. So I want to really just touch in at this point, and there are so many jump spots to go from here that I look forward to what you where you go from here, Ken.
Okay. So, how would you like to start? Do you have a specific question, a specific area of focus, or what are you thinking?
With the debt system, so the double entry account or the double entry booking trust system of the ecclesiastical, of the public, and the heavenly realm of the private, and how it really meets in the middle of understanding the practical side of what is also relational. If that
hmm
makes sense.
Mostly.
Okay, I'd
And
love to.
we'll open up that point of what you were defining or calling relational, but in a few minutes. Let's lay the groundwork. And but the first thought I had as you were asking the question about what is debt and so forth. Um, there's a quote from the founding of the United States period by one of the men who are known as the founding fathers, and so all of that. And I'm pretty sure it was James Madison, but I can't be absolute. Been a long time since I looked at it. But the quote is, uh, "People are fall short," and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, people fall short in their ability to engage with monetary economic functions and structure for the lack of understanding of coin, currency, and credit. Have you ever heard that?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to throw it at you. This is like a classroom. I'm going to ask you, how would you define coin, currency, and credit?
Coin would be the coining of an idea, is oftentimes how I say my meaning or syntax gets applied onto that word. And then that would be the coinage and the perceived amount of value assigned to a unit of currency. So the coin is a unit of currency. The currency is the exchange market or the currents that we do see as to what's exchanged for the value assigned to the larger construct of the money system of that genre of expression of USD or CDN or whatever version of currency the coinage is actually administrated in or given out as. And then change comes to mind, but I know that wasn't the other C you had mentioned.
Credit.
Credit. I broke the word credit down as the Cree D, Cree being what is spoken oration as the beginning, and then D being the French word for dear or to speak, I believe. Or is it dear is
Yeah,
true?
no, deed in French means to speak.
It does mean to speak, yes. So Cree D is like the credit that was orated through an oration that we then limit ourselves to, which I know is not the standard definition for credit, but I think
Yeah.
that it's
Well, it could
essentially,
be applied. It could be applied.
yeah.
Um, okay, so that's good. Except you just demonstrated that you don't understand those three terms.
Okay.
Okay, because a few sentences into what you were saying, you called coin the currency. So see, that's how, I don't know if you're familiar with the word to conflate, which means to mix two things together that don't really align together. So um, don't even need an example, but you basically conflated coin and currency. You mix them together. You refer to coin as the currency. To hold that thought, and then as far as credit, credit is actually based etymologically on the word credo or whatever the infinitive of in Latin, but it basically is the root of the word to believe. So yo credo in Spanish is I believe, and whatever the Latin or the French equivalent would be. So credit is based on the belief that something that has been issued from a established or accepted entity, whether it's a bank or it's an institution in a monetary system or whatever, that it is something that both parties believe has validity or relative value or specific function or use. So let's hold that thought for a moment. So that's essentially the root of the word credit, based on belief, mutual acceptance of a structure and a function that you and I or me and the bank engage in, and we believe it to be real and valid. Okay. So coin is, and you use the phrase, which is applicable, coining a phrase, coining an idea, what have you. So that's more of analogous to the basis of when we're talking about monetary function, what coin is. Coin, you've heard the phrase coin of the realm or, coinage, the 1792 Mint and Coinage Act of the United States, when the first Congress established specifics as to what constituted coin. And it goes back to a biblical base of how coin or coinage was established in what the Western world Judeo-Christian basis accepts as lawful foundations for what coin is, and that goes to the function of standard weight and measure. So coinage, and in the modern as well as long traditional, a coin basically was something that was universally accepted and recognized with intrinsic value. Generally, intrinsic value required it to be durable, endurable, that it would endure and it would last over long periods of time, and relative rarity. So that's why gold and silver were designated as coin of the realm. And so, and you go back thousands of years, you had Caesars and dictators and kings and what have you, and probably 2 to 3,000, maybe more years ago, the king or whomever had sovereign authority would put his image on the coin, whether it was Caesar or this god or this king or what have you. And it was a function of the state. And the state stood behind the standard weight measure, ideally how it was supposed to be, that if Caesar had his what's called an imprimatur, Impratur, the imprint of his image, and now we have George Washington or Queen Elizabeth on the coins and all the rest of that, that's supposed to be the authority and the objectivity or the trust in the state that standard weights and measures would be adhered to. Okay, so that's specifically what coin means in terms of what we're talking about, monetary function relative to debt. So um, there's um, two phrases or statements that can be used. One is um, money of account and money of exchange. So coin can be money of exchange because I can exchange a silver dollar with you and we accept it because it has the imprimatur. It says, Canada or the United States of America. It's got somebody's nice profile on it, blah, blah, blah. And it has a precise standard weight and measure of the amount of pure metal that's in the coin. So it's a medium of exchange. So I can carry around coin in my pocket and I can give you a quarter or a silver dollar and you accept it for its universal objective coinage and value. And so I mentioned 1792, the United States Mint and Coinage Act. They establish standard weight and measure. They said that a dollar of silver, which is different than a silver dollar, a dollar was a unit of volume. And at that time, the Spanish were the dominant minters on the planet or within the known Western world. And there was pieces of eight, and there was something called the Spanish mill dollar. Okay. And that was an accepted standard weight. So when the United States Congress said, okay, we're going to do our standard weight, they modeled it over after the Spanish mill dollar. So they call it a dollar. And they defined a dollar as a very precise amount weight of pure silver, which was 371.25 grains of pure silver. So when they minted silver dollars, that amount of pure silver would be in there, and there'd be about 10% of other alloyed metals like nickel or sometimes copper or a mix to give it durability, but it had to have that precise amount of silver. So a dollar of silver is defined the same way a quart of milk. If you have a carton that measures a quart according to standard weight and measure, then you fill it with milk and it's a quart of milk, just as it is a dollar of silver. And it could be a quart of orange juice. It's still a quart based on the container. So that's the objectivity that you want from a minted coin. So that's coin of the realm. That's the state issued coin. That's all that I just described. And it cannot generally be counterfeited or compromised, although through many hundreds and thousands of years, there were always lots of con men and criminals. They would either, fake it, plate, a base metal, lead or whatever, or they would also take a valid coin and they would scrape the edge. And they would take a little bit of scrapes and they would get a little bit from this coin and this coin and this coin and this coin. And it starts diminishing how much actual weight gold or silver was in the coin. Then they get a little pile of scraping, melt it together, and now they've gained some gold or silver. And that's why the coins today have the ridges around it so that they can't be scraped. Okay. So the United States and all the other countries at that time started with standard weights that were internationally accepted. And that was what was being referred to, knowledge and awareness of what coin really is. Mm-hmm. And the United States really set that standard in 1792. Of course, over the next 150 years, it was totally debased and flipped over and turned upside down. But then what is currency? Currency is not the same as coin. Currency can be paper. It can be a obligation of a trusted institution, which could be a bank, could be a government, or what have you. So, around that same time, the late 70s or 1700s, early 1800s, the government started issuing acts of Parliament or Congress called Negotiable Instruments Acts. And they started creating negotiable instruments, which could circulate as currency. So currency is something that circulates. It's a circulating medium. So today we have Federal Reserve notes that have no backing at all. We have a world system. Well, it's backed by the hypothecated labor and productivity of a gross domestic product of the United States and all the other countries that are part of the Federal Reserve System, which is virtually everybody on the planet, except for a few. So we'll just refer to, fiat currency as FRNs. So that's currency. It circulates. It has an acceptability and it's used as a medium of exchange, but it's not the same as money of exchange because in lawful terms, the only money of exchange is lawful coinage. So there's a difference between lawful coin as money of exchange versus money on account. So you can have money on account that you deposit gold and silver coin, and you have a specific demand for the same amount. You can take essentially a warehouse receipt. You put $10 of silver into your bank account, and they can give you an instrument that's negotiable. That means that it's a demand instrument at the warehouse. The warehouse happens to be the bank or the treasury, and you can exchange that. So you don't have to carry heavy coin in your pocket. And it's essentially a demand instrument that's negotiable. To negotiate something means you can negotiate it forward to the next individual that you exchange it for. Like I can give it to you, you give me some eggs or whatever we're exchanging for. Now I've tendered it to you and you have received it and accepted it and exchanged it. So it is a medium of exchange, but not per se money of exchange. So that's currency. And now today we have Federal Reserve nets and all the domestic currencies, and we can have vast amounts of them. Now we have cryptocurrencies that are basically currency because they circulate or can circulate. We can have all kinds of things that if it's negotiable, it means it's exchangeable. You can pass it on. But say you go to airlines and you do a lot of flights and they give you points that are valuable because you exchange those points for a flight, but it's only in your name. You can't give it to somebody else. Then it's not negotiable. It's not transferable. And so that's essentially what coin, currency, and credit is. So credit is, here's a perfect example of how a true community-based relational credit system would work as you're describing it. So if you went to a farmer's market and there's 100 vendors and there's 500 buyers circulating around, those buyers have coin of the realm. They have silver coins in their pocket that they're going to exchange. But in order to start the marketplace, nobody has any of that coin. None of the vendors do. So they all come together and they come to a mutual agreement and they say, we're all going to be able to issue ourselves, say 100 units of value. So that when we start exchanging, we're all starting with no coin in our pocket, but we have credit. The collective has issued credit to every participant, every vendor, and as the market progresses, those credits basically are used for exchanging back and forth, either with buyers and sellers or other participants, but progressively those units of credit start being retired by the buyers actually giving coin, so that at the end of the day, the vendors now have coin in their pocket and they can settle and close the credit they were issued in order to get the market going.
Right.
Because without that credit, everybody was stuck. They were insolvent. There was no means of moving the product, So, but that's very small scale. And then, like as you're saying, the relational monetary, well, that's could be commonly called barter. You know, if we live in a community and it's a relatively self-contained community, we can barter, we can exchange, we can create a central accounting system so that if you have a chicken and I have a cow, but my cow is worth, 50 units more than your chicken, then I can put it into the system. I can be given 50 units of credit. And then you have a chicken, it's worth 1 unit of credit, and you can, you know, exchange your chicken because you raise chickens, and you can get 1 unit of the cow. And now either I or somebody else has the chicken, and you have your steak for dinner, unless you're a vegan. Vegan. So, um, but how do you do that on a worldwide scale when you've got billions of people?
Yeah.
Well, that's the rub. That's the real issue. So then you started by asking about debt, which is a vast subject. It's a vast subject. We could touch on it, but it takes a lot of deep study, and most people don't understand debt. They think that if I have money in the bank, I look at my bank account and it says I've got 5,000 units called dollars. What does that really mean? Where do those units come from? How were they originated? Is there a creditor and a debtor behind that? And in our current system, all the money that we call money, it's not really money, it's currency. It's valid currency. It's legal tender. You look on a FRN note or a Canadian dollar or what have you, whatever domestic system, and it will say this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. So it can be exchanged for something, but it's still a debt, and it's exchanging one debt for another. So if you pay your utility bill with a Federal Reserve note, either cash or even electronic money on account, you are just really exchanging one debt for another.
Mhm.
People don't understand how that works. Where does that debt come from? How is it attached to me? They don't even understand that your utility bill is a form of a debt. Yes, it's a bill, it's issued. I owe $100 for my electricity, but in terms of specific um, legal and financial terms, that utility bill is actually a financial instrument. It's actually a bond, and it's what's known as a coupon bond. What is a coupon bond? Well, if you buy a bond from a bank or a corporation, and in the old days, there would be a bunch of little coupons on it. Say there were 16 little tear-off coupons because they were four per year, one per quarter for 4 years, 16 in total. Every quarter, you tear one of those coupons and you send it in to the issuer, the corporation, and they send you your interest. And so you do that 16 times. The end of that, you've earned your interest. Now the bond is matured. You give them the bond and you get your principal back. That's what a coupon bond is. Most people don't understand when you get a bill or a statement from the IRS or Canadian Revenue Agency or any taxing authority or your utility company, they are actually essentially coupon bonds. It's a bond that represents debt that was created by you giving the authority to the utility company to access the private side of your estate to issue a public instrument of debt. And the voucher, the payment coupon on the bottom, is actually essentially an interest coupon. People don't know that they have the ability to convert that voucher or coupon into a valid legal tender financial instrument that can be submitted back for the equivalent of the bonded debt of your $100 electric bill. So that's just a simple example of how um, basically monetized debt works, but we're the hidden basis of how that debt can be even issued in the first place, which gets into discussion of what is in the public, what's in the private, how does that work, the relationship of every one of us on this planet to how estate law or estate structure is created and the relationship in an estate, who is a beneficiary of the estate, or a trust, who are the beneficiaries of a trust, who holds legal title, the trustees. What's the relationship between a legal title holder as a trustee and a equity holder as a beneficiary? What's the relationship between trusts and estates? Things like that. It gets complex, although once one learns about this and sees the functionality of each increment and can see each increment in and of itself, and then how does it interrelate to the other uh, entities or instruments to which it is attached. And that's, in a way, relational monetary structure, because in our current system, everything that's circulating in the public as monetized debt, which is currency, which is debt, has the equivalent of a equity offset in the private, in the privately held estate. So there is no such thing as money anymore. There are no states that are minting and die striking a standard weight and measure coin that says this is $1 of silver or this is a gold coin with a relative relationship to the silver. In 1792, the Mint and Coinage Act, I said how much pure weight was equivalent to $1 of silver. Then they said that the ratio between silver and gold would be 15 to 1. So that meant the same weight of gold, pure gold, 371.25 grains, was actually $15. So you have $1 of silver with that weight. If you have the equal weight of gold, it would be worth 15 times. So that's your balance between standard weight and measure.
Mm.
And then later in the I think 70s and 80s, they bumped it up to $20 equivalent. So, and that's why you maybe not so familiar with US coinage, but in the 1800s, they issued a gold coin and they called it a $20 gold piece because it had $1 worth, or the 371.25 weight, and they had changed the ratio from 15 to 1 to 20 to 1. And then the beauty of the United States system in the late 1700s through most of the 1800s was that it was a bimetal standard. And the reason they did that was to keep those standard weights in ratio to each other that could not be cheated with. But then in the 1870s, the controlled Congress, because at that point they put it into, the corporate structure and all of that, Congress demonetized silver. So it then only became a gold standard. And everybody today is saying, oh, gold standard, gold standard. But a gold standard can be manipulated. It can be played off of the paper. And that's actually what they did between the 1870s and the 19 teens. So that, because what was always the case was you can exchange paper, chickens, whatever you want, but when you have a duty or a impost or an excise tax or some sort of obligation to the government, you have to pay it in gold or silver. And so they were able to play the paper that the banks issued against the gold, and they basically forced the population into essentially bankruptcy because they couldn't come up with it. There was not enough circulating coinage. So they had to go off of credit and they had to go off of paper and currency. And that's how they led up to the crash. It was something called the Panic of 1907 that crashed everything. They set up the public, oh, something has to be done. So they did do something. They came out with the Federal Reserve Act. And you know, and it goes on from there. The Federal Reserve Act established that the credit that was issued by the Federal Reserve to the federal government created obligations that had to be paid in gold. And in the same way that the government did it to the population, now the The Fed did it to the government. And then they expanded the money supply way above the coinage in terms of paper and credit because they expanded the credit. That's what's called the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s was just, everybody was, speakeasy and bootlegging and money and booze was flowing freely. Everybody's having a good time. And then they crashed everything. They pulled it all in. They called all the credit. They said, you have to pay. We can't pay. Okay, you go bankrupt. Then they went into a liquidity crisis so that the 20-year term of a federal bank charter that was given to the Federal Reserve, 1913, had to be renewed by 1933. And that's what they did after they crashed everything, put the whole country and the whole world into depression and everything. And then by the time Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated into office, they had preset all the things that they did to put the entire United States system into true full bankruptcy. And then they brought out all the rules of the bankruptcy.
They brought out all the rules of the bankruptcy.
Yeah, which were all the Banking Act, Securities Act, judicial decisions, all the things that happened in the 30s and 40s were basically the rules instituted by the administration of the creditor being the Federal Reserve, that all the things that have controlled everything for the last 80 plus years were basically legal codes and statutes that were enacted from March 33 onward into the 40s until World War II happened. And then basically they could put most of the major countries and a lot of the other countries into bankruptcy and force them to go into the United Nations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And essentially any member state in the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, by definition is bankrupt. And so the bankrupt entity has to follow the rules of the creditor. Okay. So if the rules of the creditor says you have to do this, blah, 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 then if you're talking about nation states, as UN members, IMF members, it basically meant the primary rule was they had to pledge the entirety of their central bank as a bank of issuing currency, and for a while issuing coin. All of that had to be pledged to the IMF into a global or international structure. And then as that, essentially the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, the banksters dictated all the rules of the 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way until today. And essentially the bottom line rule was that all the people, persons, which are legal entities, and property of every central bank structured nation state bankrupt had to be pledged as collateral to the world, and not the World Bank, to the IMF and the UN. And then in the 1970s, the issuance of Federal Reserve notes was greatly expanded to correspond to the petrodollar because gold was still a standard that all the issuance of Federal Reserve notes had to be adhered to, which kept it relatively stable. That's why the 50s and 60s were very prosperous economically. But then the Fed had to keep producing more and more FRNs during the Vietnam War to pay for it. And then Nixon said, well, that's too much. We can't keep exchanging these FRNs out in the world for gold. So he snipped the cord of the FRN as the standard reserve currency of the world to be exchangeable in gold. And that happened in 1971, August 15th. From that point forward, they coupled the FRN to the petrodollar, and they made everybody on the planet have to buy oil with Federal Reserve notes. So then they had to expand all of the issuance of the FRNs so that they could keep up with the consumption of oil. So as we were consuming energy in all the prosperity going forward with the 70s and 80s and, building the world system, we were basically consuming ourselves. We were consuming our own consumption of energy and all the products that were created out of that energy and going into mass consumption and building an insolvent system so that at the end they would collapse the the currency, the global currency, the FRN system, because it was totally insolvent. This was what the plan was going into the 2000s, and then call for liquidated damages for the bankruptcy. What are the collateralized assets against the bankrupt, against the issuance of more credit? They were the people, persons, and property of the world.
Mhm.
That was supposed to be the reset. But other factors intervened over the last 20, 30 years. It's what people call the white hats and all the rest of that. And many things happened, which we don't have time to go into today, but many things were done over the last 20, 30 years, leading up to where we're at exactly today, which is flipping the whole thing upside down, turning that creditor, the Federal Reserve, and its real parties and interests, which are the Rothschilds and the different families and so forth, turning them into the global debtor. And we can't discuss today how that was done, but that is what has happened. And for most people who are, watching the world scene go on now and expecting the military to come in and take over and deep six, the deep state. Um, they're thinking of it in terms of military terms, but they're not really thinking in terms of monetary terms. A lot of people they're expecting a reset or revaluation or global currency reset, but they don't know how that's really happening. And we'll talk about that another time, another session.
Yeah,
So,
interesting.
but that gets down to what is debt, what is coin, what is currency, what is credit.
Yeah. So coin is the form of currency being
No, no,
exchanged.
no. Coin is in and of itself. It's intrinsically valued. It is coinage. It's physical metal in your pocket that is coined by a state mint that does so, if they do it properly,
Hmm.
by standard weight and measure.
Hmm.
Um, Currency is anything else that circulates. Now, the currency can be a warehouse receipt that has a demand component. If you look at a silver note, if you go on the internet and you just put United States silver notes, you will see it says United States of America. It doesn't say Federal Reserve on it, and it says this. I don't know if it says note or what the word is, but it basically says this instrument is to the bearer, meaning it's a bearer instrument. It's not a registered instrument. Is can be on demand exchanged for $1 of silver. Okay. So it's currency, it can circulate, but it's backed by that dollar of silver. If you take all the silver and all the gold and you just create what we have today, then that's what's called a fiat currency. It's not backed by anything other than the full faith and credit given to the mint, the United States, etc. So that's where you have to distinguish what coin is and what currency is.
What is the bear currency or bear trust you were speaking to there in relation to something else that I didn't want to
Okay.
interrupt where you were, but that stood out to me where you differentiated between a bear something and something else.
Well, a bearer instrument simply means he who bears it,
Hmm.
you know, doesn't mean that it belongs to that big brown animal in the forest. To bear something means to carry it, you
Hmm.
know, to bear your burden or bear your, whatever, firewood or water. You are conveying it by bearing it physically, taking it from one place to the other. So a bearer instrument in general just simply means he who has it. If you have that physical bond paper instrument, it's yours. Somebody breaks into your house and steals it and you can't find them, they now are the bearer. There's no tracing or tracking of that instrument. Whomever bears it and brings it on demand to wherever, whether it's a corporation or a government mint or what have you, it's an on-demand instrument. I have the instrument, I'm the bearer, I demand you give me my dollar of silver and I'll exchange this $1, silver certificate for um, for the dollar of silver. So that's what a bearer instrument is.
A bear instrument. Okay. I hadn't heard of that expressly, but I connect it to the curse of Noah from what I've heard in Genesis of the Bible, which is said to be where we were incorporated and brought under clothes of Noah's house, or the sons who came in backwards in order to cover him and his bare nakedness, or bare trust, naked trust being the analogy that was being actually referenced in that instance. And then he was covered with their clothes, which then is connected to Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp's The Maison d'Etre, where we become the debtors because we take on the titles. And then we're moving out of our principal position into a trustee position, where then we're implied to be the trustees that have to discharge the account of the
Okay. Well, okay. So have you ever heard of the word homophone? HOMOPHONE.
I have,
Phone.
I can't remember.
Okay. Well, phone being sound and homo being the same. So homophone means the same sound. So bear is not the same as bear.
Mhm.
Okay. There's BEAR, which can stand for the big furry guy in the forest, or it could be a verb to bear something, as what I just described. BARE is bear as in naked. So you have to be clear which bear we're talking about. So a bare trust or a naked trust is one thing, and that's what you're describing, that taking on the clothing and all of that. But that's different from a bearer instrument or that definition. So don't conflate the two. Don't mix them.
No,
Okay.
most certainly. Yeah. And with the trust, with the Bear Trust, I'm speaking of the BARE trust, or
Right.
Naked Trust. Whereas if you're speaking of a bear instrument, how do you spell that bear?
BEAR.
BEAR, for a
Yeah.
bear instrument that is
Or
the
well,
bear.
it's called a bearer instrument. A bearer is one who bears something,
The bear.
who carries it. So it's a bearer instrument. I'm carrying this instrument, a certificate of stock to ABC Railroad Company, and it's not in my name. It's just the physical instrument. That's a bearer instrument. Okay, it's
Yeah.
totally different. Has no relationship to a bear trust, or BARE or something like that. BARE means naked. Okay, so it means unclothed. And so what you're talking about with Noah and the clothing, that's an entirely different thing in that if that, and I haven't actually interfaced with whole point of nowhere and so forth, what you just described. But what I'm hearing you say is that that created a obligatory uh, entity or obligatory trust and split the title. So, and that gets into a whole other discussion about what actually is a trust. And a trust, by definition, is splitting the title, legal title versus equity title.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what you had spoke to around coupons
Hmm.
and the certificates. And what I heard you say is that there's a series of them that used to be issued, and then upon issue or upon returning all of these coupons, then you were able to get your principal back, I believe you said.
Well, no, the coupons were for the interest. Okay. And you would tear them off quarterly, send them in, they would send you your interest. At the date of maturity, all the coupons are gone. You've gotten all the interest. Now it's mature. You get your principal back.
And that's because it's the fruition of the bond, right?
Right. The term. Yeah.
The fruition of the bond term is then when
Right.
you receive the interest for having invested your energy into the trust for the
Right.
specified
Yeah.
time of the
Yeah.
contract.
So let's say it's a 4-year term, 16 coupons, quarterly payment. And let's say I tear 4 of them off for the first year, but then I want my principal back. I can sell it to somebody, and it's a bearer instrument. It's physically, it's not registered anywhere. I can sell it to you. You pay me my principal. Now you get to earn the rest of the interest for the next 3 years. Maybe you say, well, you're hurting and you really need money, and I'm a tough negotiator. I'll pay you 80% of the face value of the bond. So then you get to make money on the maturity term. When it comes due, you paid 80% for it. You got all the next 3 years of interest, and then you get the principal back. So it can be passed from one bearer to the next. And then this gets into a lot of really complex detail of how it went from bearer instruments. Well, before I say that, you've probably heard stories, many people have heard stories of, I inherited grandpa's house that he built himself in 1892, and it got passed down and I inherited it. And I went into the attic and I found an old suitcase. I opened it up and wow, there's all these bonds in there, you know. Those are bearer instruments. And if you physically found them in grandpa's attic, now you are essentially the bearer or the owner. So, but then people lost them, people blah, 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 all the reasons why it had to become more convenient. So it went from that to registering it, sending it to a company like Bear Stearns. What a coincidence, the name Bear Stearns, or, a bank, JP Morgan, any sort of fiduciary trust company, you could send it to them. They would protect it theoretically. And so now you wouldn't have to carry it around. They would take care of all those things like getting the coupons, getting the interest, crediting to your account, and they would take a fee for that. Then the electronic age came on, and then they moved it into electronics. Then it got to the point where most stocks and bonds aren't even issued physically. It's all electronic. And then it all goes to a central holding place, something called the Depository Trust Company, which is in New York, where all brokers who deal with stocks and bonds and all those registered securities, if you have an account with your broker, whoever that is, like Charles Schwab or whomever, and you buy a stock, you never see it. It's electronic. It goes into your account. They handle it, and it goes onto your electronic. You can open up you know, your password secure page, and you see it. Oh, I got 10 shares of this and 20 of that. But where's that actual instrument physically located? Nowhere. Where is it electronically located? The rules since over the last 50, 60 years, they created something called the Depository Trust Company, and all registered securities are sent to the DTC, which is in New York on Wall Street, or actually Water Street, and it's held there electronically. But here's the thing. There's a corresponding company called DTCC, which stands for Depository Trust Seed and Company, as opposed to Depository Trust Corporation. That's the DTC. DTCC is Depository Trust. So you're creating a trust. It's a depository. Seed and Company. Seed, CEDE, means you are relinquishing title to it. You are ceding title. That's the definition of the word seed. So almost all securities created through the United States system are ceded to the DTCC, and they're held in trust. But they're held in trust against what? As collateral against the debt of the United States, because you're holding those electronic accounts in your franchise name and or a corporate name, all of which is pledged as collateral to the master corporate debtor bankrupt called the United States. So you don't own those securities and they're held in trust and you've ceded title as collateral against the worldwide debt.
Mhm.
So the whole intention of the agenda to collapse everything, if that had been done successfully, the creditor would have seized, taken as liquidated damages, all of the assets of every franchise on the planet, every corporate entity on the planet, and they would have owned everything as liquidated damages against the default and dishonor of the debt obligation, collateralized pledge through the central bank of every country to the UN and the IMF. That was the agenda. That was how it was set up from the 1930s onward.
That's a tremendous amount of information there. And
Oh, we're just starting. That's just
oh, yeah,
scratching the surface.
most certainly.
So, but we don't necessarily want to go any further with that, all that detail. I'm just giving you an idea because you started asking,
Yeah,
well, what is debt? Well, now we've covered it. We've done a really, what time is it? It's 12:15. So about
deep
50
dive.
minutes
Yeah.
of a quick deep dive into postgraduate economic monetary system functions and terminology and stuff. But this is how complex it is. But it can also be distilled down to very simple terms as well.
Yeah.
And as you know, this is what we do in GemStone University. We teach people these details. We very meticulously build foundations, and we've been building this with my work and many others helping in the last 10 to 15 years, but my work for the last 35 years in figuring out all these intricate details, all these codes, and studying all this stuff, the historical events, political or otherwise, the monetary events, and all of that, and then distilling it down. And how does this really, where does the rubber meet the road in terms of our personal enslavement and or our personal path to freedom, what we call freedom absolute, which is liberation of the self and the soul and everything else, because it's not just legalisms and legal structures and codes and monetary attachment and debts that is the bondage that enslaves us. It has been done in a quantum whole, multidimensional manner, which I'm sure, very well, that energetically and otherwise attaches to us at so many different levels. And you can go back to begin that, where in the modern phase, you can go back to the year 1302 and the issuance of what's called a papal bull.
Mhm.
I'm sure you're familiar with it, and it's called the Unum Sanctum. And it's, Unum Sanctum basically means the one holy declaration by the Pope, who is basically moving the papacy forward to complete absolute infallibility, because he's supposedly the vicar of Christ, the replacement or stand-in for Christ until he shows up. Well, until he shows up, we're going to hold the power of the world. And if he doesn't show up, well, that's okay. We'll maintain control. So in 1302, the Unum Sanctum, and what followed for the next 150 to 200 years essentially said that I, the Pope, and all my successors own all the land, all the flesh, and all the souls. And so, from their point of view, the last 700 plus years was set up to go into the modern age of the legal structures, the political structures, the economic, the financial, monetary, all of this to create a absolute, let's say, um, incontestable. It holds water with it is so complex, but every single thread of that complexity has a legal validity that makes up the whole. But there is a remedy of how to get out of that. But unless somebody really takes it in on a personal process of self-directed status correction, we could call it. But status correction is not just doing paperwork or documents or this and that and the other, sending notices here and there. It's the whole being self-directed transformation, because they technically have structured the nature of legal systems, law, and so forth, including the fundamentals of the law of contracts, the law of trusts, and things like that, so that we have volunteered and pledged and accepted remuneration or just consideration, equal value from their point of view. We accepted all the benefits and privileges to be able to go to the store and use their paper called FRNs and so forth. And unless you specifically, precisely, and completely um, negate and remove the presumption of consent, you have contractually consented to it, which means not only do they own the land or your house or your children and your body, and they can do anything they want with that because they own it or it's pledged collateral against the obligation of the monetized debt, they will take it further, and that what I just said is the ownership of your flesh, but they can take it all the way to, no, you've also pledged your soul. And therefore, as the unum sanctum et al., which means the continuing papal bulls for the next 200 years, basically said, we own land, flesh, and souls. And this is where all the esoteric side gets in, which, that we are very deep and wide with that, understanding the interface between the esoteric and the legal, the monetary, the geopolitical, the historical, and all the rest, because it is one whole system. And this is what we teach in PanTerra and GemStone University. And yes, it's about liberation from debt, bondage, and all of that, but it's really about, true and absolute or freedom, absolute liberation of our entire being. And it's not about taking it away from them because they never had it, but they have all these overlays. It's about severing those attachments and reconfiguring oneself to be standing, having that standing, or what people call sovereignty. And it starts with solvency. How do you actually get out of debt without having to work your whole life and pay, I owe my soul to the company store, trying to get enough FRNs to pay off the debt. Because even if you paid off every credit card, every car loan, every mortgage, and everything, you are still bonded even more than you ever realized. The surface debt, those things I just mentioned, is the tip of the iceberg. The beneath iceberg is the depth of the bondage that we're in. So it's both multidimensional, energetic, quantum, and as well as linear in the steps that one takes.
Mhm. Yeah, most certainly. Because when you talk about the sedes, the SEDES, it's like the holy sedes, which is what the Vatican, as well as Vatican City, so the body of Christ, as it's called, and then the sovereign state of Vatican City are both under the jurisdiction of the Pontiff Maximus, or the
Hmm.
Pontiff Maximus, which is the record keeper of the House of Rome. And if we haven't actually declared that we are separate from that which would put its umbrella over top of our crown, if we don't declare ourselves living and independent of that which is not of us, nor need to be related to us once we separate from the fiction of the curse of Noah within the Bible and buying the bullahs of the official seals put onto documents, that we can put our own seal onto once we know how to use our pen to correct what is wrong in order to make them right, in order to store them within the manor roll or court roll of our own house. So then we get to decide which counsel we keep within our own court of the inner realms of ourselves, our conscience, and then the larger community that we are participants in, but also have that inner council as well as the outer council.
Yes, I would concur with that.
Yeah. So this is an incredibly deep dive for people that are new and also familiar with these
Yeah.
concepts. And before we'd gotten together in uh, in a document that I had seen prior to coming on, you had wanted to speak to the two pillars of
Hmm.
the church and state, essentially, that have been upholding the fiction of the crown being a cap on our own. And what I would like to do is just actually frame that from the perspective of the maypole. And on May 1st, actually, I co hosted a Beltane event, which is not Beltane in the pagan tradition by the way that I was expressly leading it, but it's to represent, to say that the maypole itself represents the axis mundi, and axis is what we each are as the center point of the mundi, which is the world. And then that's everything around us is relative to us because we're the centerpiece. And then the ribbons that were traditionally strewn from the top and then woven together by people interweaving as it went down the chain, I have heard and then found the pieces to back up that it's reflective of the double helix of the DNA strand that is actually representing the sealing of the DNA helix from the top down, as we've been experiencing within the control matrix of what I refer to as high rose prism, of all of the insanity that we're all dealing with and calling our own things and coining our own way, as I say within the deity. But I like to just reference this in this instance because when we did the ceremony, we actually wove halfway down from the top and then also wove halfway down from the bottom, and we met in the middle. And we put a wreath around it. And I have two behind me because I'm in the golden nucleus that I came back to in my dad and Bonnie's house that was my childhood bedroom that I've come back to do this interview in because of circumstances. But it's very relevant because these wreaths were what those two ribbons of the unity and the unification took place. And earlier today, I had a session with a body talk practitioner who was helping to reweave and shift the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. And what Monica, the practitioner, said is that the masculine sees through the lens of the feminine, which then brought in the chakra systems and how all of that ties. For the upper ones are masculine and the lower ones are feminine. And you start at the heart and then you weave through these chakra systems. And with the maypole being a representation of our spine, I gave a whole lot to just say that that ceremony was changed in the way that we did it. And so, what we who are here are now doing is repurposing some of these traditional ceremonies that have been happening unconsciously or without the context of why the weave starts at the top down and what happens within the matrix of this world system of our self concept when we change the way ceremonies and traditions take place.
Very good. So what you're describing there in terms of ceremony is basically the energetic component of essentially, among other things that you described, taking back claim and ownership, for lack of a better term, of your genetics. I mean, you can use that as the energetic metaphor with the pole and the ribbons and all of that. So, but let's go deeper with that. And that first of all, so you start with two pillars. And it's interesting, you have two circles there, which if you looked at them a little bit at an angle, it could be sort of the top of two pillars. So what are those two pillars? Well, classically or traditionally, there were, when temples were designed and put onto the land, they would take a single pole, similar to what you're describing, and they would put it on a flat plane, as flat as possible, and they'd have somebody hold it, or they put it in the ground, it would hold itself there, and it would be oriented to where the sun would rise on the horizon on the solstice, the two solstices, or the two equinoxes. course, it would rise at the same place on each equinox, and it would rise in two places at the the farthest point in terms of the angle of inclination on the solstice. So from the two solstices, you would create two shadows that would cast a shadow, like to be the summer solstice, winter solstice, cast a shadow across that pole, and it would cast a shadow on the ground. And where that shadow ran across, where they wanted to open the entrance to the temple, they would put a pillar. And then on the opposite solstice, it would go the opposite way, and they take that shadow and they put the other pillar. So those two pillars were the entrance the entrance to the temple. So they would orient towards the eastern horizon. That's why in languages, the east is called the Orient. Okay, because that's how they would orient to the eastern horizon. Now, on the equinox, that shadow would come straight down the center between those two pillars. So that basically was the entrance to the temple. And this is the two temples that are referred to in Genesis, and they're the same two temples that are referred to in the lower degrees, the entry degrees of Freemasonry. And they have a name. They're called Joachim or Joachim and Boaz. And those basically represent the sun and the moon, which gets into more issues relative to the system we're in, so-called solar system, planetary system, and all of that. But basically, if you look at the roots or the etymology of those two names, it essentially, they translate to we have built this temple for when he shows up. So they're building and orienting that temple to when, quote unquote, he shows up, whoever he is at what they consider the highest level of deification or the deity and so forth. And that's how temples were oriented and built. Now they took those two pillars and they translated into functional terms relative to how our world system has been functioning for thousands and thousands of years, which is essentially the king and the priest. Now, the priest controls the temple, and the temple has the laws that the populace must adhere to in order to earn their right to be accepted within the community of the temple, the congregation, the kingdom, or what have you. And so the law of the priest is binding on the people who have entered that temple and who have adhered themselves by contract to follow those rules. So everything that has ever followed for thousands of years all the way till today, now we have congresses and parliaments and city councils and medical AMA creating rules, and each one is created by a priestcraft or a priesthood, basically. So the AMA dictates, as the priest, the law of the medical realm, and one must adhere to it. So if you have contracted to the public bankrupt state for the benefits and privileges of using their circulating medium, Federal Reserve notes, to buy and sell, live and breathe, eat and sleep, and all the rest of it, then you have agreed to the contract that you're going to follow all those rules, whether it's the medical rules of the AMA or the education rules of the Board of Education, or anything and everything that basically are promulgated as laws. You can look at them as a priestcraft, the law of the priest. And then the king has, by so-called divine right, handed down by the kings, by the so-called gods, that they have kingship by divine right. And so their claim, which is carried forward until the final expression of that in the Unum Sanctum, that the Pope basically saying, I am both the priest and the king, and I'm combining this to be in control of the land, control of the flesh through the binding of the priests and the flesh, and ultimately the souls. So that's the two pillars of our world system. And the king is designated as the true sovereign who holds the land for the ultimate vicar, the Pope. And so the entire world system can be boiled down to a very simple formula. When anybody speaks of law in the true definition of law, that in order to have standing in the law, one must have standing on the land. In order to have standing on the land, one must have the ability to stake a claim. You know, you can put four stakes, four corners, and this is my land, and you get the measures and the boundaries called metes and bounds, and you define it and you record it, and this is your staked claim. You have standing on the land, and you now have standing in the law. But if you don't have standing on the land and you're lifted off of the land and you have no claim of the land, then you have no standing in law.
Mhm.
So no matter what anybody does, they have so-called common law courts or these international courts of justice and all these things. They have no standing because they're attached by the contract to their franchise name as a bonded surety. Bonded means they're attached to, they're in bondage, they're in debt, because a bond represents debt. And they are obligated in that reduced status to follow all the codes and statutes and ordinances and so forth, all of which in aggregate are essentially the law of the priest or the many priests, all under a hierarchy or a pyramid of the top priest, which is the Pope, who claims all land, all flesh, and all souls. And then he crowns the kings. He puts the crown, he coronates, puts the corona on the king's head or the queen and says, okay, you are now the king, but he has the superior authority. If he's the one with the crown, the corona, which is the wreath around the sun, that he represents the sun. So I can take that wreath basically from the sun and I can put it on your head and call you king, but you're now still beholden to me. You're still a vassal and I am still your overlord. You're the king, you're the lord of the land. You can grant land to other um, uh, elite or landed gentry or titled barons and princes and earls and all the rest of it, but they are subordinate to you as the sovereign lord of the land. So all kingship is equivalent to, in their system, holding all of the land. That's the whole thing. Going back to the Bible, I will give you dominion over all the land and the plants and animals and everything. And the word dominion is basically dome minion. So we're all minions in the dome of this whole structure. And there are domes under which we are contained. And there are layers of those domes. And the top layer is the layer where Saturn, as a type of a sun, is stationed in what we call the sky above us. And Saturn was the Most High, El Elyon. They called Saturn El Elyon, and that means the Most High. That is the God that they were all worshiping and all subjugating themselves to and accepting the authority to be a king or a priest to subjugate all the minions within that dome and put them under the bondage and the binding construct of all of the laws of the priest and be lifted off the land because they had no landed standing except for in short instances, one of which was a period of time in the United States from 76 to into the 1870s and 1930s. But at this point, virtually nobody, except for a rare few, have real standing on the land. So you're lifted off the land. So one can make all the claims. I claim my life, I claim my genetics, whatever, but you're still bonded by many, many layers of contractual and legal monetary obligations. And until you do the precise steps that are lawfully recognize, and I know that for a fact because I've done them. I've done them over the last 30 years, and I've had a dozen attempts to come at me or come at PanTerra through various agencies. And every single time that happened, I was able to very peacefully and lawfully say, you don't have authority to do that, and they would go away. And so I know this for a fact by my own application and my own experience and my own knowledge that that's the case. And I've watched many, many, many people, hundreds and thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of people follow increments of that process. They have a grasp of some elements of what they want to achieve, but they don't do it in a comprehensive, complete whole. So they do not have they have not achieved what they think they've achieved. And then secondly, energetically, whether in this lifetime or many other lifetimes, we have entered into contracts with the beings who would like to be our owners and controllers and dominion dominators and elite and all the rest of it. We have to rescind and revoke and terminate all of those contracts. There are contracts, for example, very clean, very understandable example is if I was a monk in the 13th century in some monastery in Europe and I took a vow of poverty or a vow of chastity or celibacy or both, which usually was the case, um, and if I've never rescinded that in any of my embodied lifetimes in my continuum of all my life streams, then that's a binding contract that still is attached to me.
Yeah.
Okay. So so people wonder why they're in poverty. Well, because you took a vow of poverty when you were a monk or a nun, some time ago. Why do I not have grounded relationships with my body or partner or whatever? Because you took a vow of celibacy, or you did this, or you did that. And so it's a comprehensive whole that we have to approach all of this. And this is why we call it freedom absolute, because freedom of itself is largely illusional,
Mhm.
but there is a capacity to achieve an absolute standing in our own being if we deal with every single component part of our entirety.
Yeah. Yes, most definitely. I always say that holistic is holistic.
Mm.
And I wanted to actually bring in what I heard on the radio one day while I was driving after Taylor Swift had visited Toronto, in that they were actually performing ceremonies where they could do the ritual of marrying your best friend. And I recognize what you just spoke to because when I got certified as a soul realignment practitioner back in 2013 to access the Akashic records to find blockages and restrictions in people's soul record, to clear those, to help them relieve those stories that have come with them through past bondages or
Yeah.
agreements that they made. Who would possibly think that when you were 12 years old and you married your best friend at a Taylor Swift conference, that there could possibly be any karmic consequences?
Yeah.
This is the power of your word.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I have no doubt that in that ceremony or ritual, because they're all designed as rituals, not even ceremonies, that there's language in there that they slip in that basically bind that
Yeah,
marriage of those two individuals to Taylor Swift as some sort of corporate, all-engaging
right,
aggregate that
right.
in turn has obligations to the state, the nation state, to the Pope and all the rest of that. And they know exactly what they're doing. And so, if we were to find a recording of that ritual, I have no doubt that there would be some language inserted in there
Yeah,
about that, where everybody, is basically subjugating their will to a presumed or an indoctrinated higher power. I
yeah,
mean, it's fundamental in the religion, the Western religion. It's my will that thy will be done. You've just given your will. to a higher will. Will has to do with estates, will and testament. Testament comes from the root of the same word as testicles and testes and so forth. So you're binding your genetics by a will and testament to something outside of yourself. And then basically you have no will, which is what everything in this entire world system has moved the herd towards, binding themselves to an external will for the benefit of, well, you'll feed and house me and I'll do what I'm told. And, erasing individual will for the collective or the hive mind or the Borg. And that's what it's all about. And to bind the genetics, because the genetics is not just a double helix. It's much more multidimensional in terms of, as it resonates in our full being, not even in the physical. It's the living library of who we are from the beginning of our inception, coming from source and always connected to source. It's our individuated expression, and it's our living library. And then we come into a creational field called this planet that has living systems like forests and trees, which are the standing living libraries of this living body called what we call the earth, that's been systematically mowed down and ground up and turned into paper. And then that paper is turned into contracts that we put our wet ink signature on, and we apply our full being energetic unique signature frequency to. So we've taken the living library of the planet and we bound ourselves to it through the paper and the ink, and we've taken the living library of our whole being genetics and we've subjugated our will, and there you have it. There's the full contract.
Yeah.
And so one key point back to your maypole and all of that. So in the whole process of implementing the unum sanctum and the claim of all land, flesh, and souls, and then the two pillars, you have a orientation according to the whole construct of the world system, which is a holographic containment field that we're in. And there's this thing that we call the sun, which is actually a mirrored reflection of the plasma that energizes the life in this system and our projected individual life force. So that's where the solar worship and worshiping the sun, S-O-N, or sun, S-U-N, it's focalized and concentrated in the integration or the cross hatching or whatever to what we call the sun. And the sun moves in this regulated pattern. And it's supposed to be a year that we call 365 days. And there's 2 points on this thing that we call a calendar. One is May 1st and one is November 1st. Well, May 1st is rallying around the maypole, which is really the dismembered phallus of Osiris. And are you familiar with Isis and Osiris and that whole storyline?
Vaguely.
Okay, well, we'll get into that in a minute because it's very important. It's what controls this world. Okay, so, but for the moment, and then I'll explain it, take it as a beginning point that there's this god called Osiris who had his whole body dismembered into 14 pieces, and the 15th with his phallus. And Isis came along, found it was, he was all disarticulated, dismembered, and she put him back together, and she created an artificial phallus to artificially impregnate herself and birth their son called Horus. And Horus is the prodigal son that the whole Christ mythology is modeled after, because basically on the horizon where the sun rises to create those two shadows to orient the temple, to bring the believers and the bonded populace into the law of the priest and the temple, that the sun rises on the horizon. Well, that's Horus rising, or the rising sun. So she artificially created out of the dismembered father, Osiris, and this is where you get the father and the son thing and all of that. And there's more, which I'll get to in a minute. But basically, so all these things, the maypole, and originally in the so-called pagan ceremonies going back hundreds and thousands of years ago, there was a office called the Beltane King, and a male member of the community would be selected to be the Beltane king. And he would be able to, he would act as a king. He had everything at his whim and command, and he could have any woman he wanted, and all the food, and all of this, and the wealth, and whatever. And he lived like a king for 12 months until the next Beltane ceremony. And then the raising of the artificial phallus and the winding of the ribbons for the binding of the genetics, the double helix, and then he would be ritually sacrificed. So he got to be king for a year, and then he got to be dead. And then the next one would be stepped up to be the king. So when the Pope said, I own all the flesh and all the souls, there were two grounding points on the orbit of the sun on the calendar year of that we now calendar-wise call May 1st, which is all Workers' Day, it's all Communist Day, it's all the gathering of the collective hive mind to bind them to the artificial phallus, bind their genetics, which means their continuum of posterity forever as the genetics are passed down, which is essentially the ancestral lineal estate, because the only thing we really inherit from our ancestors is the lineal progression of the genetics we inherit from our parents. So by doing that ceremony or ritual as it was, binding our flesh to that pole, we become obligated or bound contractually to the Pope and his claim that he owns all flesh. And then when we enter into the law of the priest by taking social security numbers and driver's licenses and every contract conceivable and a bank account and using their private paper script and electronic script, we have so many contracts that bind our flesh to that structure. 6 months later, you have what's called All Souls Day or Halloween going into All Souls Day. And there's actually a third day on November 2nd. But basically, All Souls Day is the claim of the Pope or the papacy owning all the souls, that when a soul drops the carbon sleeve, the flesh, and is not living between basically November 2nd till the next November 1st. So if they're dead, if you don't have a body, your flesh is not gathered. You've already been gathered. They already own your flesh. Now you've dropped the flesh, and then the dead are gathered on All Souls Day, and basically they're harvested. So that's the two pillars, the law of the king who owns the land, and this flesh body can be called the landed estate, where the soul and the spirit has embodied to embody in this flesh, but we've contracted it away. And so then the law of the priest kicks in on November 1st, and the Pope, as the paramount priest, then gathers the harvest. And if that enfleshed or embodied living man or woman or child died in the flesh and then was harvested, and they died bonded in debt, because we are now bonded in debt from within hours of coming out of the mother, and come out of the mother, and immediately the priests of the medical system come in, the priests of the law system come in and attach social security or social insurance numbers, and the medical comes in and they jab the foot with a hepatitis B shot, and then it's certificated, then a birth certificate is created or account is created. Basically, we're in debt from the minute things start. All those certificates and bonds go to the DTC and DTCC, which is in New York at 55 Water Street. Initially, I said Wall Street. It's really Water Street. And what happens if they're held underneath the surface level? Then they're held underwater. Being underwater is the equivalent of saying, I'm in debt. Okay, so you're in debt under the waters of the Sea of Commerce, or the Holy See, the Cetus Sanctum, as you said, seed to seed, CEDE, is the same as the Cetus, which means the seat of the Holy Cetus Sanctum, which is where you get SS. And so you have Isis as the two pillars along with the Cetus Sanctum, and basically claiming your being, because it's is. So you are, but you were, because once you do that, you no longer exist in reality. You're only a pledge, collateralized, bonded dominion. And so that's where the two pillars come in. And that's how the entire world system, legally, monetarily, politically, economically, and so forth, how it's all structured.
Wow. Very intense and very insightful. And I am aware that we've been together for more than 2 hours. And so I want to be respectful of your time. And
Well, that's fine. We've actually been recording since 20 after 11. So if we want to do a full 2 hours, we still have about 20 minutes to go, if
we've
you
got
want
about
to.
20 minutes. Okay. Well,
Because there's some more that we could cover with all of that.
all right. We got 20 minutes to cover it. Then, Ken, I'll let you keep going there.
Okay. So where did that come from, Isis and Osiris? Well, in the Egyptian pantheon, which means basically the uh, the realm of the gods, there's a top level body which is called the Ennead, and Ennea stands for, or not stands for, it's the Latin for nine. So it's basically a council of nine. The head of that is the head honcho in many places in Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, many other past civilizations. And his head, that name of that god is Anu or An, A-N or A-N-U. People have heard the Anunnaki or the Anuna and all of that. Well, it's called that because the Anuna simply means the people of Anu. And so he's considered the head god, and he's considered the solar deity or El Elyon, which really means Saturn. And so Saturn is named after, or can be shortened to the name Set, and I'll get to Set in a minute. So you have Set and you have An, which is basically two names of the same entity. You put those two names together, you get Satan or Satan. Okay, this is where the concept of Satan comes from. And it actually comes from the two gods, the two brothers going back to Sumer called Enlil and Enki, which I'll come back to in a minute. But basically, going to Egypt, you have the Ennead, and you have two sets of brother sister twins who were also married to each other. One set is called Isis and Osiris, the other is called Set and Nephthys. And Isis, Osiris are the gods of light, and Set and Nephthys are the gods of the dark. So it creates up the dichotomy or the polarity of good and evil, light and dark, basically the Masonic checkerboard squares of black and white checkerboard. That's in original temples, Westminster Abbey, and places like that. So they were considered say, the upper set of four underneath An or Anu. There's a lower set of four, which basically, and I always forget their names, but basically they were the four gods of earth, air, fire, and water. Basically, they were the four primary elements that were the grounding or the pillars of physical reality into which we have incarnated. And as the story goes, Set killed Osiris, cut him up into those 14 parts, and then the 15th being the phallus. And what I said earlier, Isis comes along, creates an artificial phallus, which are grounding points for what the obelisks were for. And those obelisks were put in primary geomantic energetic places on the planet, such as in Egypt, such as in Rome, in London, in Washington, D.C., in New York, and other places. They are energetic grounding points to hold the containment field energetically to keep us from accessing our higher capacity, our higher nature, and all of that. So basically, the New Testament, the Christ story, and all of that is just an Isis Osiris mystery cult. It's just a retelling of the same thing. So basically, when John the Baptist loses his head, that's basically the phallus, what we call, the male phallus. We call it a Johnson or various names. Well, John the Baptist, it comes from Johann and various derivations of the name Anu. So that's where the name or the word for the first month, January, J apostrophe ANU means of Anu. So January means Anu. He controls time. He controls the calendar because he's the equivalent of Saturn, who in the Greeks um, uh, naming of the gods was known as Kronos. Chronos means chronology, means time. So these are the gods of time that are stuck here because they're the parasites who disconnected from source and never can return to life unless they face every single karmic entanglement and every deed they've ever done against life and against living creation, which is vast. So can they do that? Well, technically, yes, but will they? No. They are lost in time. They are trying to bind us to their calendar lineal construct that we call time, which has a finite cycle, and we are at the end of that cycle, which we can't get into this time. We'll cover it next time we talk. But we're at that's why the Bible is structured the way it is and all the other systems, because there is an end of time. It's not the end of the world, but it's the end of the time loop that we're currently in that follows a set pattern over and over and over again over eons of time or moments in non-time. And so John is just a derivative of Iago in Latin. So you have Santiago, which means Saint James or Saint John, and it all goes back to Johann and eventually it goes to Anu. So everything is named after Anu as that head god who is El Elyon, the god of time, Saturn, Kronos, and all the rest of it. And any pledge to that god is a pledge to be bound in time and stuck within the law of the priest and lifted off the land into the containment field because only the king owns the land and we're just part of the civil body that's controlled by all the legal attachments and so forth. And so if you take the letters of Set, Isis, Osiris, and Nephthys, it's S-I-O-N. This is the root of the word Zion. That's spelled Sion, S-I-O-N. And so this is why Zion is such a thing, Zionism and going back to, Israel. And Israel is nothing more, which I'm sure you know, Isis, Ra, and El Elyon. So Is, Ra, El. So Israel is just simply the first corporate merger that was done leading to this whole storyline in the Old Testament of everything that's there, which we don't have time to go into. But that whole story that Set killed Isis and dismembered him and caused the phallus to be lost is essentially analogous or metaphorical of us losing the balance and the wholeness of our masculine principle within the field that is our natural feminine, which is the regenerative principle. When we are a whole being balanced with masculine and feminine, has nothing to do with sexuality or genitalia. It has to do with the energetics of what is a true masculine principle. The masculine principle is our will. And so when we're split in half and polarized, good versus bad, dark versus light, Set versus Osiris, then basically we have no ability to be grounded in our physical body. We have no will. If we have no will, then the feminine gets suppressed, and then the regenerative capacity of self-healing and rising above this, binary coded polarized reality is beyond our reach. So this is the substance and the essence and the energetics. Going back to the Egyptian pantheon, it goes further back to Sumerian and who Enlil and Enki are. And basically, Enki became Osiris, became Horus, and eventually became known as the Yasus or Yasos Christ, or the Christed being in the New Testament mythology. And basically, it's just the split of our soul from our spirit, or our true being from our greater principle. And so they created all these religions and iconography and rituals and everything around these fundamental stories that could be real with real beings, or they could just simply be holographic inserts that were put into this hologram and created the templates to build the religions and everything off of it. And there's a lot more to say about that. But but the last key is that Enlil, as I said, Enki became that lineage. I said Enlil became the equivalent of An, or was the equivalent of An, and he was known as Set, so that's where you get the name Setan or Satan. Enlil was also called the territorial administrator in Sumerian law, and territory means the whole planetary body. So he's the administrator or the prince or the king of the physical reality. And so, but Set eventually transliterated and ultimately became known as Yahweh. And so it's just that lineage. And if you go back to the origins of Enlil and Enki as two brothers, a good brother, a bad brother, and you get Satan or the devil, and you get the enlightened one or Osiris or Horus, the rising sun, and all of that. Enlil had two power instruments. One was the net and one was the bow. Okay. So let's bring that from ancient Sumerian symbolism to the modern period we're in now. What is the world agenda system trying to do? They're trying to jab everybody on the planet to artificially modify the genetics so that they can be corporately patentable, so that they legally can own what's in your body and the genetics and in your cellular mitochondria and all of that. And how do they do that? They do that with this thing that goes like this, right? And how is that going to be interfaced to create a hive mind Borg or a complete control system as we see being implemented now? Through something called the net or the internet. So, but how does this relate to the bow? Well, then you got to go from Enlil and Sumer to Egypt to Babylon to Greek and the Greece pantheon, and you have this sun god named Apollo. Okay. You have rocket ships going to the moon called Apollo, right? And Apollo had a bow and with the arrows in his bow, and he had a wife, and his wife was called Corona. Okay, the crown. So you have the sun god married to a feminine abstraction called Corona, which is the crown that the Pope from the sun puts on the head of the king to lift everybody off of the land to be bound by the law of the priest. So Apollo has his bow and his arrow, and Apollo and Corona had a daughter, and her name was Pharmakia.
Mhm.
Okay. And pharmakia means the poisoned well, or it means sorcery. And so if Apollo dipped his bow into his daughter's well, it would become poison. So it's the arrow of the poisoned well, or a thing that goes like this into the flesh, injecting the sorcery or the pharmakia or the poison, the waters of the poison well to attach to the genetics, to attach to the internet or the net of Enlil, Set, Satan, Yahweh. And basically they have billions of people worshiping Yahweh or derivatives of that, and they think they're worshiping a true creator being or a God when we are the creator beings. We're the captured creators who have been projecting this false reality because we aligned with the script. And essentially all we have to do is sever the attachment to that script, sever the presumption of consent, and remove the legal monetary binding elements of those contractual bonds and basically reject or dissolve the law of the priests and regain standing on the land and harmonize and resonate with the living body of the true feminine principle and the earth and this landed estate so that we return to being creator beings who can recreate in this creational field a world that truly honors all living things and all of life so that all of this false reality implodes on itself and dissolves. So that's how it works.
Yeah, wow. Well, with Apollo, when I break up the word, I see a pole and then owing being what is left when.
Hmm.
Did you know that the word journey starts with a J-O and ends with Y, and you then have an earn left? And so part of being within the matrix control system is that we have to earn our way, or that we get cremated and then buried in an urn with an E. But without the E is the earth
Right.
that is the vessel to transport the cremated body. But with an E, it actually is a poll box or a ballot box. And that's where then I've been saying for a couple of years now that the real pole shift, that as much as on the outside we're going to potentially experience, I believe the other pole shift is switching from our head into our heart.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, we have three brains,
Mhm.
all three of them, in the head, in the heart, and in the gut.
Yeah.
It's about integrating, balancing, integrating, detoxifying, removing the toxicity, whether that's pharmaceutical toxicity or it's food toxicity, water toxicity, or energetic toxicity, so that more of who we really are comes into and is embodied in this incredible vessel that we have, or not a vessel, don't want to call it a vessel, in this incredible living system that we direct through our masculine principle, which is our will. And we remember how to regenerate, which is realigning with the true feminine principle, so that there is the illusion of death is removed, the illusion of disease is removed, and all the rest of that. And it certainly starts with rescinding all the contracts that we've ever made in this lifetime or all lifetimes, including to Enlil and Set and Osiris and Yahweh and all the rest of that, if one wants to truly return to wholeness and real standing and sovereign integrity.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what people are really needing support with, understanding not just the how to practical from those who have actually went the way to blaze the trail in order to be able to say from lived experience, this is a viable way that I have lived and am able to speak to from that experience, compared to having theories that we think will work, but that's just then the edge of the ledge we've known, because knowledge is only what is written or been spoken or conveyed between people that believed a common concept that took us out of the present moment, where our power to intuitively feel whether something is true or not, it no longer is able to operate within the ledge of knowledge that takes us out of the present moment to go into another moment to read something that somebody wrote when they were in the now. So, really getting back to the present moment and to understand we are the gift, and all of this insanity and unpacking it. There's a lot of people that are leading people on the public stage right now that I've been speaking out and saying over the years, hey guys, I know you're saying your platform is solid, but what I'm telling you is that I see there's air underneath of that stage where you're leading my friends over top of. And I'm
Hmm.
not speaking this to you, but I'm saying that when I have challenged people and said such a thing as the fact that, with the Magna Carta of 1215, and the fact that King John had already made Pope Innocent the vassal of the kingdom in 1213, King John
No,
didn't.
he made the Pope the Lord, and he put himself under vassalage. He gave his whole kingdom rights and titles to the Pope in exchange for absolution from all his sins.
Right,
So yeah, so the Magna Carta, yeah, was a sham instrument because the Pope, right after it was signed, negated it, says, you don't have my authority to sign that. You're my vassal, I'm the Lord. You can't do that.
right. Yeah. So England became a fiefdom of the papacy, which is what all the papal bulls and papers of contracted form with four squares to be able, or four corners of a page, which is then the position within the court of a page, what is the page? I want to say the messenger, the queen, the king. What is the one that I'm missing? in this moment of the court characters in between the
Oh,
minor arcana and the major arcana in tarot?
oh, I'm not sure.
The 10,
If you're going on chess, there's the king and the queen, and then the bishops, and then the knave, which people call the horse, and then the castle.
right.
Um, but I'm not that familiar enough with the tarot to
Okay.
be able to answer that part. So
Yeah, no, it's very relevant. I think it might just be the 10, which my astrologer friend Claudio Silvaggi that I'll have to invite or introduce you guys to one another. He speaks to the one and the zero actually being in relation to the binding and the it being tied together. And I can't remember the specifics to be able to properly share it, but he
yeah,
knows and is able to really go deeper into this. And I think that's really what this conversation is opening the door to, is for people who have went further, who have collected a vast body of knowledge and also lived experience, who have enough will to actually take action, whether it's been a blazed trail or whether it's trying something that's never been tried by anyone else, but that there is a method able to be shared to be able to then compare notes around what we've done and find the way that will work to be able to not just get as many of us out of the matrix as possible, but to actually minimize the amount of carnage that comes with the collapsing of the system.
yeah,
It does
yeah.
occur.
Well, you know, the system is not necessarily going to collapse. And, as I said to you before we started recording, I do have some insight and connection to the fact that there is a safety net that's already in place. It's going to shift to, because if it collapsed, that's what the deep state, the cabal, that's what they want. Because collapse, that's their saying, out of chaos emerges order, or however they say that. They want chaos. They want collapse. That's then they come in and they implement their order, which is their new world order. So I'm happy to say that there are things in place, that there is a safety net. But that doesn't mean that, oh, okay, it's safe, everything's fine, and we got all this now. There's new money and so forth. It's not going to be like that. That part is going to be there. But the everything we've talked about here, it's still binding on our being, everything, and that's where the work comes in. And just because you have money and you pay off your monetary debt from the old system, where all those debts are forgiven and they go away, doesn't mean that the binding nature of the karma and many, many other energetic attachments, that they automatically go away right away. They don't. You have to walk the process, the inner process and the outer process, to integrate the being and remove that which is not who we really are. That's what we do in PanTerra, that I'm confident to be able to say we are the only organization that not only has more depth and integrated applications of what the law really is, because I've seen it all. I've been around for 35 years. I've watched everybody in the past, in the 90s, 2000s, 10s, and now in the 20s, come out with their variations. Some call it status correction, some call it this, that, or the other, but they're all missing parts, and they're all missing a lot of the fundamentals, which I'm not going to go into because we want to close now, but we can start with next time. How do all the specifics and the fundamentals attach to all of this broader brushstroke information that we've gone over in this last 2 hours? They're there, they're real, they are binding, and they have to be resolved. PanTerra is the only um, grouping of people who addresses that, both in the legal aspect, the monetary, the law, the historical, the esoteric, and the inner work that also deals with the physiology, trauma and stress, and the breakdown of the physical body that can be rebuilt. But there's a lot of levels that are very hidden, that we very few people actually see, but we work together to open that up. And once seen, it can basically be walked and integrated and resolved. And that's what real healing is, and that's what true freedom is, to be free. So people are thinking, well, we're going to be free in the new money system and there's no debt. That's just the beginning. That's not freedom absolute. That's not whole being freedom. That's why we are now calling what we're doing as freedom absolute. We've used that phrase for many years, and we just instituted that with, YouTube and so forth. And the one last thing I want to say uh, before closing is before we started recording, you and I were talking, and you were asking me the question, well, why create something like PanTerra as a place where we come out of the matrix, but we essentially could be looked at as reattach ourselves to something that's essentially built on the same model, calling it a society, calling it a court, calling it, all these things with records and so forth. And the reason is we live in the world system. We have been bound by it our entire life, this lifetime, and many, many lifetimes. And, I use the phrase for decades, the only way out is in. So we don't pull, when I say we, meaning my work in PanTerra, don't polarize with the system and say that's something that we reject or we don't want to be part of. We can't not be part of it, but we have the absolute capacity to take the model of what is a nation state, what is jurisdiction, what is contractual um, elements that bind one to the agreement of a contract, and use them to the highest and best application for what we want to achieve, which is true freedom or freedom absolute. Because if you disconnect from the matrix or the world system and go and just say, well, now I'm free, um, the system will look at you and act upon you as a stateless person. Okay. So what we've done with PanTerra over 30 years, we've established the cognizance of PanTerra as a true sovereign body politic. It's been recognized. We're going to actually increase or complete that recognition in the next couple of years of what a true sovereign body is. And that's the whole 2-hour conversation in itself. But I know that's true because I know it's been honored at every single level when it's come up against the system. And so as a sovereign body politic that people can step into and adhere to contractually as a jurisdiction, then they cannot look at us as a stateless person. And also, we do not reject our national identity, but we remove the binding nature of that national identity. So you can still be a Canadian on the land of what people call Canada or North America, but you specify and designate what your standing within that context is. And so as a private national, you have the ability to move seamlessly throughout the world system. So this is how we've designed what PanTerra is. It jurisdiction as a sovereign body politic, and it has been tested, road tested for many years, and it's proven to be so. And so that is a key element of we don't want to be seen in the system or in the world as a stateless person because they can control you as a stateless person. And so that's why I created and designed PanTerra out of all of the things I've studied over 35 years in law and 50 to 60 years studied many other things. And it's going to be able to be strengthened and expanded. And it is also very much designed as a decentralized distributed model. It's not hierarchical. A lot of people accuse me of, oh, Ken just is creating his own kingdom. He wants to be lord over you and blah, blah, blah. And that's not how it's designed. It's designed so that it is really the people. And the court, which is the core of the jurisdiction, is the court of the people. And it's the law of the people. So what is ultimately necessary is we begin to substantiate we are the law. We don't fight their law. We stand above it, but in peace with it. And so that the court of the people within our private jurisdiction is based on the fundamental of the substantiation of our being and our beings together as the law and the law of the people, and that we can draw every beneficial or, you know, appropriate element of law in all of world history and adopt it into our law form, which is what we've been doing for many years. And it's still a work in progress. It's going to take years to continue. It's going to be lifetimes to continue. But by substantiating it, we now become the creator. We're the pole, the anchor. We replace this false maypole, the false, artificial phallus, the control that I've described through the genetics and all the rest of it. We replace it with our true living embodied presence that continues to substantiate and grow in strength. And as we do that, we are more capable of creating within this creational field, and that diminishes and exponentially implodes this false reality.
Yeah. Do you create manor roles or help people actually create their own manor role or court role for their own life, which
Mhm.
is what the metaphor for the house is?
Yeah, we don't call it that. Based on common law, a court in law is called a court of record.
Hmm.
Basically, a court of record is the sovereign who establishes his or her court. This comes from kingdom law, where the sovereign or the king had his own court, and even though there's limitations and modifications of what people think about the Magna Carta, it did start something in progression of establishing, trial by jury and other elements, but it was all applicable to the barons. They're the ones who forced the king to sign it. So it wasn't the common serfs or the landless peasants who had the same right of trial by jury. It was the people, the men who held the land, the
Yeah.
landed titles and all of that. Well, that's how it was then. We can transmigrate it or transpose it into our law because it is our law, as I just described. So, pursuant to the common law, the law of the land, when a being brings a court, it's his or her court of record. Of course, traditionally or historically, it was never women. They didn't have that right. But our law form establishes women are certainly equal in law. So his or her court of record, and the court is the evidentiary body of everything that's brought into the record of that court. And pursuant to common law, a court of record, the sovereign actually is the one who issues the final order or the judgment order on the case. But the jury, trial by jury, simply means the jury has the right and the standing to determine on the basis of both fact and law. So if I bring my court of record and bring my evidence in and name a defendant or a group of defendants, they are protected by a trial by jury because the jury can substantiate the validity of let's just call it universal principles of law that the sovereign who brought his or her court establishes as the law of the case. So from the very beginning of somebody becoming a member of PanTerra, the first thing they do, the first document we have each one do is there's actually three. One is called, the primary one is a mandate of non-consent. It immediately establishes that I do not consent to everything, all of this binding nature, because consent is equal to, acquiescence to the terms of a contract. So a mandate, a mandamus, an order by a man or a woman with real standing, and they have real standing in our court, issues a mandate of non-consent. So now it's on record within a permanent court of record within the court of the people in the archival system of the court of the people of PanTerra Vita Society that you have issued that document. Then what's issued are two writs, and a writ is a common law order, basically. One is a writ of habeas corpus, which basically claims your body. I claim my body. I record it in this court of the people, but it's the writ that is issued by me as a sovereign being or sovereign integrity by my sovereign free will. And the other is a writ of prohibitio, which prohibits a lesser inferior court or agency or office from penetrating the authority of that mandate of non-consent and writ of habeas corpus. Now, people will ask, well, does that work? Does it hold water? In many cases, it has. In some cases, not, because we're dealing with basically evil people, rogue agents who have sold their souls to the devil, who will do anything to maintain their position of power, whatever, judges, prosecutors, etc. So no, it doesn't work every time, but we have to establish the principle and stand on it and substantiate it with our being to make it real. And then we build it in substance as more beings come in and we, you know, hold it as our law. And so that's where people start. And those documents are immediately put into one's court of record, and it establishes the beginning of one's evidentiary body that can then be supported by the other elements that have been written in how the court operates. And if people want to see how that is, you can go to PTV for PanTerra Vita, ptvcourt.org, and read through it. And the articles of the court are in there and public notices and many other things. So this is the work I've been doing for 35 plus years. Many people have joined me for the last 10 and up to 15 years, and we're building it. And we've had a lot of rocks and boomerangs thrown at us, but we're still standing and we're still going forward. And now we're at a point where it's really substantiating and really building. So I invite everybody watching this, please have a look. Come join us. PanTerraVita.org, ptvcourt.org, freedomabsolute.substack.com, Freedom Absolute on YouTube, GemStone University on YouTube, and gem.university. That covers it. And gemstoneuniversity.org. So if you're really interested in true freedom, come have a look. And if you like, come join us.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ken. I really appreciate your time today and for sharing everything that you've been doing and for everything you have been doing for as long as you have to blaze a trail and also be able to say what didn't work so it saves people the time of having to
Well, yeah.
those
It
painful.
saves you having to do 35 years like I did.
Exactly.
Nobody has 35 years left. But you have to dedicate 2 to 4 years to really do this. You're not going to come in and, here's a few documents, print them, sign them, put your thumbprint on them, send it to a few people. It doesn't work that way. You
Yeah.
have to do the work. And yeah, I've done the work and opened it up. That's why I have gray hair now. But I'm still very young and I'm still very alive and got a lot of decades ahead of me to now start building the new reality we wish to build. So,
Fantastic.
and thank you. Thank you, Laura.
My absolute pleasure. I appreciate your contributions today. And for everyone that's been watching, if you haven't already left a question, why not? And please do. So let us know what questions this triggers for you. Get involved in the conversation, and there will be more coming. So stay tuned. Peace out. Peace in.
So, yeah. Okay. Thanks.